Hi, this is Paul. Little something different for you today, but then again, not different. While I was in Grand Rapids, I was trying to have something to read that was different from everything else that I do for work. And for years, I've been a buff of World War II. I always read World War II books in my youth and very much enjoyed it. Haven't done much of that for quite a while. The YouTube channel Kings and Generals has been doing the Pacific War week by week for a while, and I stumbled upon this a couple of months ago, and then I started watching the videos, and it was great. I was just going week. I've just kept one after another, after another, after another, until about the time I hit, just before I went to Synod, bang, I got current with the Weeks and Generals treatment of the Second World War bit by bit. I had also been listening to Hardcore History, and they were doing the war in the Pacific. Dan Carlin was doing the war in the Pacific, and then that was sort of the last one that he did in Hardcore History. I'm not exactly sure where he's gone or how he changed, but he'd been doing Hardcore History for a long time and is really enjoying that. I was part of my fixation and fascination is, of course, Japan is an interesting example of modernity and a traditional culture, because the Japanese went after it in many respects full force, and the naval machine that they built and began the Second World War with was an impressive naval machine. And so I was fascinated by that. I explored a few podcasts around there, and I thought, shoot, some of the podcasts I found, I didn't think they were all that good. So then I went back to the Pacific Crucible. I went back to Ian Toll's Pacific Crucible, and I made it all the way through. The first book, and really enjoyed it. And so today I was running errands with Freddie and Justin and Gordon, and so I was able to listen to little snips of it and finished up this book. Anyway, I listened to the epilogue, and because I listened to the epilogue and I was thinking about some of the early comments I had on today's video, where I did a little bit of commentary, really just a lot of replaying, but a little bit of commentary on some of the recent videos with Peugeot and Vervaeke and Peterson. And one of the commenters basically said, your older videos, I think based at what I understood that comment to say was that your older videos, you're doing a lot better translation than you're doing now. You're sort of getting sucked into the language that is emerging and evolving in this little corner of the internet. Now, I don't think the evolution of that language is a bad thing, because I think, generally speaking, Vervaeke is right that if we're actually going to have more knowledge and be able to talk across traditions, we're going to have to do some work on understanding each other's terms, not having terms that sort of kneecap or straw man or play any of those games, because you just waste a lot of time with these rivalrous games if you can't get together on the same language. I mean, you can always agree to disagree about some things, but at least let's be clear about what both of us are talking about, and let's be fair in the conversation. So we're talking about, and again, we don't have the language. Vervaeke's talking about hyper agents. I don't particularly like hyper objects, because I think, again, that gets into the whole realm of objects. But it's very clear that the individualist, materialist ontology is insufficient even to really grapple with realities that are not physical. Now, you can apply this in almost any circumstance. So I've been doing a little bit of application of that with respect to the body of the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church. But as I was finishing up Ian Toll's Pacific Crucible, the epilogue got into some of these same things now. And again, once often you start something like this, you don't unsee it. This particular book begins at the beginning of the war, does a little bit of getting you up to speed in terms of why Japan evolved in the way that it did. That's something that as if I don't have a reading list that is probably more than I can muster before the end of my life, as if I'm not already too curious about a number of things, including the relationship between clowns and drag queens, as I mentioned on Twitter this morning. I'm really, again, quite curious about the transformation of Japan and how that led to the invasion of China. It could never fully swallow China. China was just way too massive. But its aspirations of becoming an Eastern empire. Japan, of course, quite famously didn't have very many natural resources on its own island. It could find many and abundant natural resources on Manchuria, and it desired the oil and rubber that the British and the Dutch had in their colonies in Southeast Asia. And of course, when the United States, watching the atrocities in China, and while the United States was sort of supporting the Chinese nationalist Chiang Kai-shek, of course, Chairman Mao was fighting Chiang Kai-shek and the Japanese both. So it's a very, very big, complex history that leads up to the attack at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt eventually cuts off Japan from the kinds of materials it need to make war, which was oil, scrap metal, and all those other industrialized materials, giving the Japanese the idea that perhaps they could, with a swift blow, knock out American naval forces in the Pacific and gobble up the British, French, Germans. They had already gobbled up the German start at colonies after the First World War in Versailles, and the Dutch holdings, and in that way establish for themselves a much more enduring imperial regime. And the cultural transformations that happened in Japan were really quite in the Meiji Restoration, the imperial court, all of those. It's really fascinating and interesting history. And it does, again, lead to these questions of, what was Imperial Japan? What is Uncle Sam? These higher beings, let's say, like nations, like empires, act in certain ways. And again, if we look at the apocalyptic literature, such as the book of Daniel, when you have the Prince of Persia, you could talk about the Prince of Imperial Japan, you could talk about the Prince of America, and those of you who are familiar with the Pentecostal movements over the last 50 years, they feel very at home with that language. That language, again, would pretty reliably be scoffed at and dismissed by the dominant secular material individualist language that would say, yeah, there are nations and yeah, we sort of understand how that works. But the question is, does this attempt at new language and nomenclature help? Now, friend of the channel, Digital Gnosis, has, I think, a back and forth that he's been waiting to have, given that he's been pecking at me with these kinds of questions. And so he actually got the attention of John Vervaeke in the comment section. It would be interesting if Nathan and John had a little bit of a conversation at some point. I'm very sensitive, though, to the concern. I mean, Anselman raised some concerns in his comments on today's video, and a lot of the other concerns that basically all the thinky-talky stuff in this little corner of the internet just gets increasingly esoteric, and it just sort of floats away on us. And now this little corner of the internet sort of is turned in on itself, and many of the people who got interested in Jordan Peterson and a bunch of the stuff that sort of came up just sort of don't understand, because to pay attention to all of the language, and again, I think the language is actually a very helpful addition, because it raises specificity in many respects and differentiates. But all of that raising specificity and differentiation is very much part of the life of the academy, and to the degree that the academy is itself a branch off of the church, sort of the corner of the theologians. But part of how the church is different is that the church in many ways can't lose its train of people all up and down the scale. And so it's important to pay attention and to look for illustrations. That's basically what pastors do. Pastors are sort of illustration machines. They seek to understand some of the chatter and conversations going up in some of these theological or academic levels and try to bring it down to earth in terms of stories, or even, if you listen to John Vervaeke's and Jordan Hall and Jonathan Pageau's conversation, they kept calling it that level, say, the mythological. So there's a lot going on here. And so I thought actually using Ian Toll's Pacific Crucible, basically summing up the events from the beginning of the Second World War in the Pacific to the battle at Midway, where the book ends. If you listen to this alongside of a lot of the other conversation that we are doing, you can maybe begin to grow some imagination in terms of the utility of some of this language. So I thought I'd play some of it in audiobook form, and we'll see how the YouTube copyright algorithms do with it's hit or miss with a lot of audiobooks, but we'll see how it goes. I think this is very clearly an example of fair use. So let's pick it up now after the Battle of Midway. And there are lots of good, if you want to know something about the Battle of Midway, just put in the Battle of Midway on YouTube and you'll find lots of really good videos that sort of show you exactly what this battle was about, why it was an incredibly important turning point in the war. But again, we just talk about the Battle of Midway, and we sort of have a container around the Battle of Midway acting as if we sort of know what we're talking about with this. And to a great degree, we do. But I think the author nicely sort of shows the evolution of our consciousness of the Battle of Midway. And of course, in human affairs, this happens over long periods of time. And the Battle of Midway is far enough in our past that we have a degree of perspective on it, and the rest is history. They had one of their earlier episodes, almost when is history? And it's hard to do history with anything closer than, let's say, 50 years, which is sort of 2 generations. So let's dive into this, and let's pay attention to the language and see if this connects up with any of the new language that we are developing in this little corner of the internet.
They had won the battle, that much the American officers and sailors understood, but they did not yet know the dimensions of their victory, and whatever elation they felt was tempered by uncertainty, disorientation, sorrow, and exhaustion. In his journal, Robert Casey observed that the whole story of the Battle of Midway would not be told for some time to come. This was a cataclysm observed by tens of thousands of eyes, and yet a spectacle that no man saw.
Okay, right there. So right away you have the sense of when life is happening. We don't know. See, this is, the more you explore this language, the more you bump into the fact that the language that we generally use is sufficient for what we're generally doing. But very quickly, this is part of C.S. Lewis's point in his book Miracles, very quickly you have to sort of get more deeply into metaphor in order to adequately map and convey it. So the Battle of Midway happens, and of course, when it's happening live, where is the battle? Well, it's thousands of individual human beings having individual human conscious experiences. You've got fighter pilots, you've got admirals, you have sailors on the ships, you have admirals, away from the action that are seeing it through the lens of just little drips and drabs of communication. One of the key things of the Battle of Midway is that the American code breakers in Pearl Harbor had broken the code pretty significantly, and so Admiral Nimitz was able to set the American pieces, which were, the American planes weren't as good. The American flyers weren't as good. The Japanese had all the advantages, but because, here again, it's another level of consciousness, because Nimitz could sort of envision the battle beforehand, he knew to a sufficient degree exactly when and where the Imperial Navy would show up, and therefore he could plan his countermeasures, which would lead eventually to his victory.
He wrote, "Hundreds of men brought back their little bits of it, bits that sometimes fitted together and sometimes didn't, to make the mosaic in which we may one day see the picture of what happened at Midway."
So there's sort of, you see the mapping, all these little bits, and at some point everyone starts comparing notes. And the reporters go out and start getting information from people. And then, of course, later the historians, especially after the war, well, now suddenly there are records available from Japan. You can compare those. And you see this emergence of information coming together to form a picture and, in fact, a story. And a book like this expresses the battle as a story.
Ensign Mears, one of the few survivors of Torpedo 8, he had not been assigned to fly, recalled that the Hornet aviators tried to collate their experiences into a coherent account, but there remained many questions that none could answer. Bit by bit, as one fits pieces into a jigsaw puzzle, we learned from one individual and another, by rumor and hearsay, what squadrons had attacked what objectives and the results.
So you get a lot of these little data points. Okay, you get a lot of these little data points, and this is of course where modernity shines. Okay, get the data points in terms of the physical. Where are the planes? Where are they at? What are they doing? What are they thinking? Well, that's more upper register, but at least get the data in terms of the physical lower register all set, because it's an integral piece of the puzzle. But again, via combinatorial explosiveness, the world is just full of data. And so what? It's all part of a much bigger story.
They knew nothing of what had happened to the defenders on Midway itself, or in the Aleutians, or what the Army airmen had achieved. What did it all mean? What was the relative significance of these events? No one could say with confidence. Every carrier aviator knew, as a matter of cold statistical fact, that his profession was among the most dangerous in the Navy. From the earliest stages of their flight training, and many times since, they had been warned that they would lose friends and squadron mates. But the irrevocable finality of death, as one young dive bomber pilot put it, came as a terrible shock. There was never a...
And again, well, here we see, again, the consciousness. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is sort of the developmental stations that you go on in life. I was talking to my wife, who's an elementary school teacher, and she was talking to another elementary teacher the other day, and they were talking about the moment, usually sometime in fourth grade, when the children begin to develop another level of a sense of humor, when all along the teacher has been telling little jokes that they never get, and then sometimes at some point in fourth grade, one child will begin to laugh, and then more and more will begin to laugh. And then somebody will say, "What is everybody laughing at?" And by fifth grade, they're all laughing together. But then you get to deeper levels like irony. Irony doesn't come until quite a bit later. And so now you have to ask yourself, where does a sense of humor exist? Where does irony exist? What type of thing is irony? And so you have all of these fragmented little experiences about, well, what is the Battle of Midway? And, well, then it all gets put together in a story, in a package, and Ian Toll writes it down, and so then we see it. Oh, this is the Battle of Midway. But we know that there are thousands and thousands of battles of Midway by all of these men, now almost all of them, I'm sure, dead, because this was 1942, now 60 years ago, and most of the people participating this had been at least late teenagers or in their early 20s, and many of whom were making decisions were quite a bit older, and just by virtue of our lifespan, they're gone now.
Body to bury. The slain airmen were simply never seen again, with confidence. Every carrier aviator knew, as a matter of cold statistical fact, that his profession was among the most dangerous in the Navy, from the earliest stages of their flight training and many times since.
But of course, a 20-year-old doesn't know death like older people who have experienced death in one way or another.
They had been warned that they would lose friends and squadron mates. But the irrevocable finality of death, as one young dive bomber pilot put it, came as a terrible shock. There was never a body to bury. The slain airmen were simply never seen again. Their deaths were potently symbolized by the rows of empty chairs in the carrier ready rooms. The reaction of the pilots to the annihilation of their comrades was one of bewilderment, wrote Mears. There was no evidence that they had been killed. The dead just were not there, and it was hard for the others to realize that they never would be. Ensign Clay Fisher recalled entering the Torpedo 8 ready room and finding it completely empty except for the pilots' uniforms hanging on the hooks, left there after they had changed into their flight suits. Both young ensigns, Mears and Fisher, were assigned to sort through their fallen colleagues' personal possessions and pack them off to the next of kin.
And here we have other layers of consciousness. Oh, they're my buddies. Oh, and there's this revelatory, there's this revelation that, well, they would never have gone through their buddies' packs before in all probability, but now suddenly they open their buddies' packs and an entire other new world just opens up to them. Limited. Now, of course, if they had been in their 40s or 50s, that world would have been richer and deeper because it would have had resonance from the rest of their personal experience. But in their 20s, they haven't had that much personal experience.
They did the job with heavy hearts. Mears, going through every person's private effects, seeing a characteristically battered cap, a girl's picture, an earmarked prayer book, or a wallet with various cards in it, made us realize how much each one would be missed at home. On the other hand, there was no arguing with the fact that the Japanese Navy had sent an enormously powerful fleet into battle and lost 4 first-line carriers. The American colors still flew over Midway Atoll, and the remnants of the enemy fleet were in abject retreat toward Japan. It turns out that we have fought a major engagement, one of the biggest naval battles of all time.
It's very interesting when I was listening to, I think it was Tom Holland's brother, when he was a guest on Tom Holland's podcast. Tom Holland's brother is an author of, I think mostly, I don't know, maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, European World War II history. He made the comment that, Hitler didn't really recognize he had started a world war. Hitler had been taking one act after another, takes back this demilitarized zone between Germany and France, rearms Germany. I mean, he just kept taking one step or another, waiting to see, well, will the other European powers stop me? And so the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and Poland was just next on the list, but it was, of course, Poland. Now, of course, the Soviet Union collaborated with Poland. That, of course, then finally, to a degree, then the Allies declare war, but of course, the Allies do nothing. And there's a lot of speculation that if England and especially France had the major land army, if France had immediately attacked Germany, well, perhaps the war could have ended quite soon because, of course, the Germans didn't have that many really able mechanized troops. There were a lot of horses used in the Second World War, something which people often don't recognize. So if France and England had immediately attacked Germany by land, well, the war could have, in fact, very much have been over quite quickly. But, of course, they didn't do that. They waited behind their Maginot Line and, letting Hitler, finish up Poland and then bring all his army over and then conduct this grand maneuver that they tried in the First World War, but it had failed in the First World War.
Casey observed. And miracle of miracles, we have won. It was too stupendous to contemplate as we lolled in a mist of nervous exhaustion, mumbling to one another in senseless monosyllables, falling to sleep over our coffee.
Now, to a degree, they knew that they had fought in a battle, but of course it was going to be a Japanese battle in which the Japanese had the initiative. They were, in some ways, just fighting defense at the Battle of Midway. Yet, what is a battle? Well, it's a series of events. Yeah, we get that. But it obviously is a sort of thing that will transform the consciousness of the two bodies. Pearl Harbor transformed the consciousness of America. The Doolittle raid that didn't do a lot, but bombed Tokyo, transformed the consciousness of Japan and pretty much said, well, we have to be much more defensive. We have to push our boundaries out further. We don't want, the homeland being bombed. And so each of these events transforms. And again, we're so used to operating this way. But it's good to just pause and watch ourselves paying attention and say, because well, what is this? And what is a nation? And how is a culture? There's going to be a lot of comparing and contrasting, at least from the Japanese side and the American side, because of the Americans, first began the war with sort of the racist dismissal of the Japanese, and the European powers had done this quite a bit, and Japan was able to capitalize on it. And then suddenly the idea that the Japanese couldn't do anything. Then after that, very quickly, the Japanese were war-crazed fanatics who stood 10 feet tall, and on and on and on.
Nimitz had followed the course of the battle from the operation plot room in the SINCPAC headquarters. The room, as Leighton described it, was a rather primitive affair that consisted of a large chart of the Pacific laid over plywood across a pair of sawhorses. Over that chart was placed a large sheet of tracing paper, and a staff officer continually drew in blue crayon the known position and tracks of American and Japanese fleet units. Scattered radio intercepts had told the tale of the battle. Nimitz and the staff had alternated between elation and anxiety as the action progressed. On the morning of June 4th, Nimitz learned of the Massacre of Torpedo 8. Leighton recorded that he was as frantic as I've ever seen him. He appeared agitated and called for his communications.
And even this, in terms of Nimitz, of course, is embedded in the story. And, okay, so here you have this squadron that is wiped out. One of the things that you see early on in the war is that American attempts at launching torpedoes from airplanes, the torpedoes malfunction. The airplanes aren't as good as the Japanese airplanes. The American flyers aren't near as experienced or well-trained as the Japanese. The Japanese have better equipment, better torpedoes, better airplanes. And, well, what does that mean? Well, Nimitz understands what it means, and if you sit him down and say, okay, Chester, explain it line by line, and he could sort of walk through all of what this meant. But go back to the Peugeot-Peterson video. Well, we can do that.
Every visual scene is incomprehensibly complex. There's an indefinite number of ways of seeing everything. And this is partly why we don't have general purpose robots, is because AI engineers originally believed that the problem of robotics would be the computation of action in the world. But it turned out that the problem of robotics was seeing the world. And that
now again, pay attention to how Nimitz is seeing the world. Sawhorses, a sheet of plywood, a big map. You don't really have cellophane, plastic as well as we have. So they got tissue paper, and they're drawing with probably grease crayons on this and having little. He's seeing the world through that. I mean, we're incredible. We're incredible creatures. He's seeing the world through that. But it sort of makes Peterson's point.
really shocked everyone, because when you look at the world, it's like, well, there it is, no problem. You just open your eyes and bang, there are the objects. And yeah, they're It's like, well, how many of them? Well, you could get lost in the details of this carpet if you were a photorealist painter, you know. You could take just a section of the carpet and it would take you...
Now, I mostly listen to these videos because, you know, I listen to them while I'm driving, while I'm doing the dishes, while I'm getting dressed, while I'm doing all sorts of things. But those of you who are listening to this can't see, if you look at the video itself, they are... Jonathan and Jordan are sitting in two red chairs, and there's a table between them, and Jordan has two seltzer water bottles, and Jonathan has two regular water bottles, and sitting on a table between them, and they're sitting on a carpet, and the carpet is blue and red and with probably a flower pattern, and it's very intricate. And so that's part of the illustration that he's making for the live audience.
Maybe 3 weeks to paint it in a high-resolution manner. And even then, you wouldn't have captured anywhere near the detail, and you'd only have done it under one condition of illumination. And that's just a fragment of a visual scene. And so I started to get extremely interested in this problem, which was the problem of attention. How do we reduce the indefinite multiplicity of the potential landscape of perceptions to the self-evident things that we see? And the answer to that turns out to be extremely bizarre. Partly it's... well, we don't see objects, we see meaning, and we infer objects. And that's quite the bloody revelation when you start to understand that, because, you know...
And this, of course, Nimitz is just seeing meaning. He's using little tokens in order to help track how the meaning is attached to objects. But again, this gets back to Peugeot. Is a battleship an object? Is an aircraft carrier? An aircraft carrier is a multiplicity of objects. But what an aircraft carrier means, well, that's just dawning on the consciousness of the admirals at, you know, the Japanese got there first, and the Americans learned it pretty quick.
Modern people, atheistic materialist types, they think, well, it's sort of a dead world intrinsically, and you overlay a meaning on top of that, and that's a secondary overlay because the object perception is primary, and it's not real, the meaning. It's like, that isn't how your brain works. You see meanings. So for example, with little children, there's an experiment, for example, called a visual cliff. If you take a baby who can crawl and you put, imagine a table like this, and then another table the same set here, and then a plate of glass between them. If you have the baby crawl towards the vision.
And again, you see this diagram in just about every college psychology book. I can seem to remember the picture of mine from, when did I take college psychology? Maybe 1983.
Visual cliff, the baby will stop. And the reason isn't that the baby sees like an objective pattern and thinks, oh no, I can fall. They see a falling off place. And then maybe they can infer some common objective pattern out of that. But we see meanings. Our primary element of our perception is meaning, mapped right onto our body. And that really upends the whole, in some sense, the whole empirical notion of the way that we act in the world, the whole rationalist enterprise, although less that. And it poses very strange epistemological questions, so that's questions about the theory of knowledge, but also very strange ontological questions. So for example, if you're a Darwinian, think, okay, well, we evolved to perceive the world in a manner that's accurate enough to ensure our survival. And that's about as accurate as it gets in some sense if you're a Darwinian. Well, we perceive the world through stories. Actually, like technically, well, does that mean that the world is a story? Or if not, what does it mean? And the answer to that is, it's not so obvious. And one thing that has become obvious that Jonathan and I have talked about a lot is that it's clearly the case that we see the world through something that when we describe it is a story. So you prioritize your attention through a structure of value. And you can't see unless you do that. And so that even means that the objective world, and this is something the postmodernists also kind of pointed out, the objective world isn't even so clearly objective, not in the way we thought, because you can't even see objects except through a hierarchy of value. And so we've talked a lot about, well, what that hierarchy of value might be. And you've hit that particularly from a more theological perspective.
Well, one of the surprising
officer, Commander Curtis, to know why we were not manually drew in blue crayon the known position and tracks of American and Japanese fleet units. Scattered radio intercepts had told the tale of the battle. Nimitz and the staff had alternated between elation and anxiety as the...
So they're getting the battle as a story, as pieces of the story through you got radio intercepts of the Japanese that they're decoding, and then you've got communications from the American fleet.
Action progressed. On the morning of June 4th, Nimitz learned of the Massacre of Torpedo 8. Leighton recorded that he was as frantic as I've ever seen him. He appeared agitated and called for his communications officer, Commander Curtis, to know why we were not getting any messages or hearing something. Although they must have known by now that they could break radio silence, it seemed that our task force commanders were neglecting to keep Nimitz informed of what was going on. Later that afternoon, Spruance broke radio silence to report that 4 Japanese carriers were hit and burning. A relieved Nimitz sent a dispatch to all units. You who have participated in the Battle of Midway today have written a glorious page in our history. I am proud to be...
Notice that it's named already. But even though he hardly knows anything about what happened,
associated with you. I estimate that another day of all-out effort on your part will complete the defeat of the enemy. On June 6th, he issued a communique which appeared the next day in the American newspapers. Pearl Harbor has now been partially avenged. Vengeance will not be complete until Japanese sea power is reduced to impotence. The Sink-Pack allowed himself a bit of uncharacteristic levity. Perhaps we will be forgiven if we claim we are about midway to our objective. The remnants of Kido Butai crawled westward to fall in with the main body. Admiral Nagumo, whose flag now flew on the light cruiser Nagara, told his staff officers that he was inclined to take his own life, and some vowed to join him.
Okay, well, what is that? Well, it's a culture. Well, what is that? Well, it's this. Can you really manufacture your own values? You don't live long enough to do such a thing. That would involve trial and error. In fact, you're always doing trial and error anyway. You're testing all these tiny little values, but there's so many values that you're nested within. And as Peterson said before, you're connected to everyone in that way. And so when he says, well, maybe I should take my life, well, others are joining him. Why? Where does that come from? Well, it's sort of part of the body that is the Imperial Navy of Imperial Japan.
But Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, rejected suicide as a coward's exit. You are just like hysterical women, he told them. First you get excited over easy victories, and now you are worked up to commit suicide because of a defeat.
Okay, cultures are very complex things. There are things that sort of live in the culture, and then there are counters to it. And you see there sort of the countering of it, and each person is sort of weighing this. I was thinking about this in Synod. All of these individuals come to form up the body of Synod, and they all come with different experiences, and they share their stories, and they have these values, and it all comes together, between one another.
This is no time for Japan for you to say such a thing. Why not think of turning a misfortune into blessing through your efforts? Nagumo listened, but was not immediately persuaded, replying in low tones, You must understand that everything a commander-in-chief does cannot be by reason. After further discussion, Nagumo relented. Very well, I will never commit a rash act. The surface ships were crowded with survivors of the late carriers, and many slept on cramped decks exposed to the weather. Miyasato Yoshihito of the Chitose recalled burying the ships dead at sea. The crew stood to attention while the naval anthem Umiyukaba, Across the Sea, was played over the loudspeaker.
Was that religious?
An honor guard fired a salute. A casket was released into the sea. It didn't sink for quite a while, he recalled, and we could see it drifting farther and farther away, in and out of the waves. As dawn broke each day, the cruisers and battleships launched their float planes to fly search patterns back toward the east, but those aircraft had little value in aerial combat. The fleet had no fighter protection at all. If caught by the American carrier planes, they would be sitting ducks, and they all knew it. On the other hand, there was some hope that the American flat tops could be coaxed into air-striking range of Wake's big land-based bombers, or perhaps even the guns of the Japanese battleships. On the morning of the 8th, it was apparent that the Americans had given up the chase. Ugaki observed, We had no choice but to give up our intention of launching an all-out counterattack with the whole combined fleet. with fuel.
Now again, well, what's happening there? Well, now they have all learned on both sides that the age of battleships is done. Now, obviously, between the First and the Second World War, they had these treaties limiting the number of battleships, because battleships were these super weapons. They could lob shells 20, 30 miles. They could devastate coastal cities and, of course, many important cities around the coast. Battleships are the super weapon, and aircraft carriers they're these experimental things. And, of course, the Americans were sort of playing with it, and the Japanese were coming sort of taking notes. And, of course, they immediately saw how powerful this weapon was. And of course, by this point, the Yamato, this greatest battleship in the world, the greatest battleship that had ever been produced, quite likely, now suddenly is nothing compared to, well, an air attack. And the age of battleship is done. Well, what does that mean? Well, where does that come from? Is there How does that work? And again, most of us will say, no, the age of battleship is done. But I want you to sort of pause and think about how strange this is. And think about, well, there's an age of battleships, and it ended. Well, obviously, technology was a big place of that. Aircraft had to get to the point that they could take off from an aircraft carrier. They had to get to the point that they could carry heavy ordnance. They had to get to the point that they could actually move fast enough and maneuver swiftly enough to evade, various kinds of anti-aircraft fire. But the age of battleships is done, and everybody knows it. So now everybody knows how to behave new in this different age. And it's very Darwinian, because those who don't learn it, they die.
Running low, there was nothing left but a long, melancholy passage to the home islands. The combined fleet staff, in their cavernous quarters on the great flagship Yamato, stared out to sea, shocked and depressed. They said little.
And again, all of their depression, where's that coming from? And again, all of us look at it and say, well, it's just obvious. Of course they're depressed. They lost this battle. They lost their friends. It's going to begin to dawn on them that, it's now, of course, dawned on them that the Americans are not going to negotiate a peace, as had been the Japanese assumptions about American culture. And now suddenly they see meaning. They see meaning all over the place. And they're probably right, mostly right, but again, they don't know. The future's open.
There was not much that could be usefully said. Yamamoto's yeoman, Mitsuharu Noda, recalled that Air Officer Sasaki looked as if he felt he was personally responsible for the defeat, showing it in his growth of beard, his sunken eyes, his unhappy, weary face. Yamamoto himself was sick, sallow, and deflated. He spent most of his days behind the closed door of his stateroom, said Noda, and appeared only briefly to stand on the compass bridge and sip rice gruel. Ugaki noted that the commander-in-chief suffered from a stomachache which did not improve much in spite of treatment by a fleet doctor. This, too, is a source of concern in such a grave moment as this.
So, in other words, this physical being that is Yamamoto, a very famous, high-status man, his physical health isn't simply determined by, what he's eating and exercising and how much sleep he's getting and all of this biological stuff. The psychological stuff is integral. He sees meaning. He lives in a world of meaning. He's amphibious in that. That's what this meaning crisis is all about. He's having his own little meaning crisis with the loss of the Battle of Midway.
The ailment was diagnosed as roundworms and treated with doses of vermifluge. By June 9th, he seemed better, though his officers noted that Yamamoto had been out of action for rather longer than treatment for worms would normally have required. As Nagumo's force joined up with the main body...
Right there. As his force, so all these various remnants after the battle, they come back and they join up with, look at the language we use, the main body. Well, if you read the book, you know that the beginning of the book talks about this naval doctrine that emerges in the 19th century of massive numbers of ships for a definitive battle, and therefore that's how you can win a war. And so, it's a main body. Well, it's the main body made of. Why would we use that word body? But there it is.
On June 10th, Yamamoto's staff played nice. No blame was shed, for indeed all must have realized that the greatest weight of responsibility for the defeat rested on Yamamoto's shoulders. Yamamoto had acknowledged as much, declaring that the defeat was all his responsibility and they were not to criticize the Nagumo force.
there's culture. Well, what does a high status, honorable man do? He's in charge. He made the call. He takes responsibility. The underlings, again, I mean, people are skeptical about the transference of guilt. There's an example of it right there. Who's responsible? Was it? Well, he says, I am responsible. I'm on top. I will take the guilt.
Genda, Onishi, and Kusaka, appearing haggard and exhausted, went aboard the Yamato by breeches buoy. Entering Yamamoto's private cabin, Kusaka said, "Admittedly, we were not in a position to come back alive shamelessly after having made such a blunder. But we have come back only to pay off the score someday, so I beg you from the bottom of my heart to give us such a chance in the future." Yamamoto replied curtly, "All right." Ugaki tried to ease Kusaka's mind, offering him gifts and even money, and listened for the first time to the eyewitness accounts of the demise of the 4 carriers.
Giving gifts and even money. Offering gifts and even money. Isn't that interesting? I don't think you saw this in the in SINCPAC or in the American admiral's quarters, offering gifts and money. We don't do that in our culture. They do it in theirs. Well, where is that culture? What is that? It's, well, of course we just look at, okay, that's the culture. We're used to that. But again, just take a step back and notice the strangeness of it.
The 3 men returned to the Nagara that afternoon. Since December 7th, the people of Oahu had lived under the constant threat of invasion. Now, as the American fleet returned to Pearl, they breathed easier. For the first time in 6 months,
They see meaning.
the safety of the Hawaiian Islands seemed assured. Nimitz often went down to the wharves to greet returning ships. As the Enterprise and Hornet slid into their berths, the carrier air crews left their ships and checked into the Royal Hawaiian or the Moana Hotel, both on Waikiki Beach, which had been commandeered for officers R&R. They plunged into their customary all-night bacchanals, but their carousing was more anguished than joyful.
Notice, well, why is this? Well, again, all of us sort of know, but they were physically unharmed. Shouldn't their bodies be working? Why is their escapism versus alcohol via alcohol and women different now because of what happened? Where are we? What are we?
Some young men wept drunkenly for their dead friends. Others brawled or vandalized hotel property. The MP's shore patrol and hotel detectives were harassed at every turn. The routine of the returning airmen for the next few nights consisted of their tramping from room to room hunting for liquor, talking, arguing, fighting, and breaking the furniture, Mears recalled.
They're having their own meaning crisis.
Some few were feeling tender enough to want to find a girl, but for the most part their emotions were released in being just as mean as they could. I saw 2 boys who were good friends beating each other in the face with their fists, not trying to duck or box, until they both had black eyes and were crimson with blood.
Isn't that interesting? And again, it's so noteworthy and unusual that it makes the book some decades later.
Another pilot tried to throw his smaller friend out of a window. The aviators were infuriated by press reports wrongly crediting the Army Air Forces with sinking the Japanese
You think only the press today gets a lot of things wrong?
carriers. When airmen of the 2 services met in Honolulu, hard words were exchanged and in some cases fisticuffs.
So now we have these other principalities. You've got Army Air Corps and you've got Navy, and they're fighting each other over what the press has done. It's like, well, why should that matter? Why don't they go beat up a reporter? But these 2 bodies, the Army Air Corps and the Navy flyers, are in a sense alive in a space that the message and the erroneous messaging, because if you listen to the story, the Army Air Corps didn't hit a blessed thing. They bombed from way too high up, and they contributed something that the Japanese had to keep dealing with them, which basically made it easier for the Navy to come in. But again, think about the strange stuff. Now we all understand it because we live within it, but then why go through all this paying attention to these various levels? Well, maybe because when we see anomalies like 2 friends beating each other up, not blocking shots, you say, oh, it'd only be natural to block shots. No, I want to beat your face and I want you to beat my face. But that doesn't make any sense. It makes sense on some level. On what level?
Until after the war would it be conclusively established that Navy dive bombers had done all of the damage to the Japanese fleet. In Washington on June 7th, reporters filed into a naval headquarters conference room to be briefed by Admiral King. It was King's first press conference since the start of the war. In comparison with the losses of the enemy, he said, United States losses are inconsiderable. He admitted that it was not yet clear what was happening in the Aleutians, partly because heavy fog had limited contact with enemy forces. A reporter asked if it was true that the Japanese had hurled their entire navy into the conflict. Perhaps not everything, but the bulk of it. One of their methods of doing things is not to send a boy to do a man's job. Pressed to reveal whether...
Notice the use of a proverb. Don't send a boy to do a man's job. What does that have to do with this thing? Aren't they almost all sort of boys out there doing these things? No, but the United States Navy is a man.
The American fleet would pursue the retreating Japanese forces, King grew touchy. He pointed out that the Japanese had substantial shore-based air power on Wake Island. With 130 million amateur strategists in this country, many would undoubtedly advocate some such follow-up action, he said, but for us to rush into a mop-up operation would not be well advised.
Okay, so now you've got the body of American opinion dealing with, well, it's a democracy, so now they have to deal with it. I'm going to jump ahead to a few more points in this epilogue. Then you get the two different stories told, well, in the two different countries.
Hiraide, an Imperial Headquarters spokesman. Naval operations have crossed the international dateline and entered the eastern Pacific area, while the occupation of western Aleutian Islands has pointed a sword at the enemy's throat. Rear Admiral Tanitsugu Sosa, writing in the Nichi Nichi, explained that the next stage of the war would take the Japanese Navy to California. Now that America's northern attack route against our country and the most important enemy base in the Pacific Ocean have been crushed by the Imperial Navy in the recent battles of Dutch Harbor and Midway, Japan can now concentrate on attacking the mainland of the United States, he wrote. With its east coast constantly menaced by German and Italian warcraft, and its west coast fully exposed to the possible attack by Japan, the United States has been driven between the devil and the deep sea. Reported Japanese losses were suspiciously vague and inconsistent. On the 10th, the Navy Ministry notified all commands that the official tally would be cited as 1 carrier sunk, 1 carrier and 1 cruiser damaged, and 35 airplanes lost. The next day, a well-known civilian naval expert reported in a radio broadcast that 2 Japanese carriers had been sunk. Not until June 21st did the Navy promulgate its official story about the fate of Kido Butai. 2 carriers, Kaga and Soryu, would be taken off the ship's register when there is suitable opportunity, i.e., the Navy would tacitly admit that they were gone, but quiet.
Now, of course, all of these were sunk. They, in fact, well, they had to be scuttled. So, and it was a point of shame that the Emperor's own torpedoes would sink the Emperor's own ships, especially their most famous and important aircraft carrier.
Quietly and in the most enigmatic manner possible. The Akagi and Hiryu would remain on the register, but will not be manned. In other words, the Navy would concede that they had been damaged, but maintain the fiction that they had returned safely to Japan and were undergoing repairs. It was essential that secrecy will be maintained and discretion manfully exerted.
See, now we're dealing with this body that is Japan. And so even though it's an imperial, it's a very complex system. You have the emperor, who's kind of basically been captured by the generals. Public opinion still matters.
Had these accounts been intended to mislead the Americans, they might have had a valid military purpose. Indeed, the Americans had suppressed news of the sinking of the Lexington after the Battle of the Coral Sea. But the Japanese also claimed that the U.S. Navy had lost a San Francisco-class cruiser, a submarine, and 150 planes. Assertions the enemy could not be expected to believe. Mitsuo Fuchida observed that the Americans had promptly announced to the whole world the damage inflicted on the Japanese, accurately naming the ships damaged and sunk. Thus it was clear that our efforts to conceal the truth were aimed at maintaining morale at home rather than at keeping valuable knowledge from the enemy.
And again, what is morale? Well, if it's built on a lie, well, that bill's going to come due at some point, and it will. But what is morale? And why is it important? And what is its value?
The Japanese fleet put into Hashirajima on June 14th through Bungo Strait waters shrouded in a gray fog. Returning crewmen were shuttled from ships to bases to overseas posts, where their eyewitness accounts of the battle could not seep out into civilian society. Many were confined to base, while others received brief liberty passes but were warned not to travel to Tokyo on penalty of arrest. Wounded men were carried off their ships in the dead of night, sheets drawn up over their faces as if they were dead, and quarantined in isolated medical wards. Though he was not seriously injured, Fuchida was put in a secure ward at the Yokosuka Naval Base. "My room was placed in complete isolation," he recorded. "No nurses or corpsmen were allowed entry, and I could..."
So what's the relationship between these individuals and the body? And what exactly is information, and how powerful is it?
"could not communicate with the outside. In such manner were those wounded at Midway cut off from the rest of the world. It was really confinement in the guise of medical treatment, and I sometimes had the feeling of being a prisoner of war." Nagumo and the top surviving officers of the 1st Air Fleet staff met on the battleship Kirishima. There was much discussion of needed changes: better plane handling, armored flight decks, better damage control, and firefighting procedures, a larger complement of Zeros to fly combat air patrol over the...
Okay, so these are all physical, material. These are fairly straightforward, lower register adjustments in order to meet the advancing threat of the United States.
Carriers. Many Japanese officers blamed the defeat on inadequate reconnaissance flights. Air Officer Minoru Genda later gave his opinion that a lack of emphasis...
So now we're looking for cause. We're looking for reason. Okay, well, if we had better reconnaissance, if we had known that there were 3 American carriers out there, then Nagumo wouldn't have been setting up his planes for another attack run on Midway. Instead, they would have prepared and would have gone after the American carriers. That might have made the difference. Or doing a lot of relevance realization.
On patrol flights and reconnaissance was the vital cause of defeat. The Japanese were fully aware of the importance of reconnaissance, and yet, in spite of that, we esteemed attack forces too highly. Admiral Nobutake Kondo agreed. "We met with fiasco because we did not get any sign of the existence of an American task force near Midway Island. The need of high-speed, long-range reconnaissance planes was badly felt."
Now, what's interesting is that the Japanese actually had some of the best long-range reconnaissance planes of anyone in the world already. So then how do these decisions get made? Now, suddenly, in all of the different minds of the generals or the admirals, to one degree or another, before it was have a bias towards aggression, have a bias towards action, have a bias towards attacking. And that's not always a bad strategy. Now it's pay attention to reconnaissance. Pay attention to reconnaissance. Knowledge is what defeated us in this battle. It's also interesting if you go earlier in the book when they talked about the fact that culturally the Japanese carriers did not have the training or equipment or attention paid to fire suppression, whereas the American carriers had more attention paid to fire suppression and so therefore did a little bit better. Same thing with aircraft. The American aircraft were larger, slower, better armored, little bit heavier weapon. Japanese aircraft, lighter weaponed, but quicker, and especially the Zero could climb a lot better. And so along the way, everybody's doing all of these adjustments to try to accommodate the advantages and deficiencies of their own equipment and their own tactics.
"It was our great regret that we lacked sufficient measures in establishing guard screens by means of submarines both ahead and to the sides of our fleet.
The Americans and the Japanese used submarines in very different ways.
As well as the fact that we failed to have some submarines go to Midway Island beforehand to get some information. Japan's 2 remaining fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were organized as Carrier Division 1. They would remain under the command of Admiral Nagumo. Many in the fleet blamed Nagumo for flaccid decision-making in the desperate hours of the morning of June 4th, but Yamamoto refused to allow his subordinate to take the blame. Now, somewhat belatedly, the Japanese Navy acknowledged the primacy of carriers over battleships and other surface units. Hulls that had originally been laid down as battleships were converted on the stocks to new carriers. Reassured that the Navy had won another spectacular victory, the Japanese public had no reason to expect heads to roll, and no senior officer lost his post. Yamamoto remained one of the most prominent and beloved figures in Japanese public life, but it was he who bore the greatest share of responsibility for the Japanese defeat. His plan had dispersed the fleet too widely, forfeiting the possibilities of mutual support. It had violated Mahan's most fundamental tenet, concentration of forces, and for no good reason. It allowed the American fleet to isolate and destroy Nagumo's carriers, before any support could be rendered by the other elements of the Japanese fleet. On June 10th, the New York Times quoted an unnamed Japanese admiral who had commented in a Tokyo newspaper on the result at Midway. Though the admiral had not revealed details of Japanese losses, he did hint that the Japanese Navy now anticipated a prolonged war of attrition in the Pacific. He maintained that Japan's superior endurance and fighting spirit would prevail in such a struggle.
Okay. Upper register. Endurance and fighting spirit. We Japanese can suffer more than you weak Americans. Now pay attention to the cultural differences that are being addressed in this section. There's a really interesting section earlier in, well, it's not as easy to jump around in the audiobooks as it is on YouTube. But I mean, the Japanese had this entire mythology about themselves as sort of the chosen nation, and the world used to be ruled by Japan in some primordial point. And so you had racial elements of racial superiority, elements of cultural superiority. You had all of those things, which, you know, today when we listen to all of the woke, anti-woke drama, it's, you know, it's white supremacy, and these are, what's so amazing is that even in, let's say, the woke attack on history, there's an element of racial essentialism that is somehow a mirrored version of the kinds of things that you see even in this mythology that Imperial Japan had been promoting.
If the war should be protracted, both sides would be greatly exhausted, he said. Hence, in the long run, that side would lose that first tired of the struggle and the losses entailed by it. 2 days earlier, the New York Times had quoted Admiral King, who emphasized the importance of American material superiority. In a war of attrition, said King, the Japanese would be gravely disadvantaged because their capacity to replace their losses is all too obviously not equal to our capacity.
Okay, so pause. So you have these two nations. And again, we easily map this thing out to a degree. Were the Japanese deluding themselves, or do we simply believe what we believe from our perspective?
Here, neatly encapsulated in these two remarks, were the two combatants' strategic paradigms for the remaining war. Japan's transcendent fighting spirit was to be pitted against America's overwhelming industrial military might. For the 3 years of war to come, the Japanese acclaimed their unique Yamato spirit and willed themselves to believe that it must deliver ultimate victory. They believed themselves to be a race like no other, a family of 100 million, the figure was about 30 million too high, racially pure and homogeneous, descended from the gods and united under the benevolent guidance of a father emperor.
Does that sound like religion to you? Did they see it as religion? How about what's about to come in terms of American religion?
The ideology was reinforced and disseminated by official slogans. 100 million advancing like a ball of flame. Think as one, act as one. Extravagance is the enemy. Fired with overriding spirit, the Japanese at home and on the front lines would endure privations and hardships that the enemy could never withstand. They would work harder, eat less, and face death with samurai-like indifference. The new ethic was derived from traditional samurai and Zen ideas. At the same time, it was a monstrous perversion of those ideas. Military production and the relative size of the American and Japanese economies meant nothing, as one commentator said, for true combat power is arms multiplied by fighting spirit. If one of them is infinitely strong, you will succeed. As a corollary to that equation, it followed that nothing was impossible. Every failure was, in essence, a failure of will. The answer to any military problem was to exhort the soldiers, sailors, and airmen to strive harder, to find the motivation to overcome whatever difficulties they encountered. They must abhor retreat or surrender. As the war grew more desperate in 1944 and 1945, many Japanese servicemen resolved to seek death for death's sake, to die as one of the emperor's limbs. For death in combat was a kind of ritual purification, and to spill one's own blood was akin to the Shinto ablution with water. For all its industrial military power, the Japanese militarists calmly asserted, the United States lacked the requisite intangible spiritual qualities to prevail over Japan. A mongrel people, hopelessly individualistic and democratic, pitted against one another in bitter capitalist competition, the Americans would soon tire of the fight and go home. American women, whose excessive political influence was symbolized by the prominence of Eleanor Roosevelt, would not tolerate the loss of so many husbands, sons, and brothers.
And again, some of these things just don't change, do they? We're talking the 1940s here, the early 1940s.
They would demand an end to the bloodshed before the war ever reached Japanese shores. Therefore, it followed that the harder and more brutally the Japanese waged the conflict, the more quickly American resolve would wither. So it was said. If the premise had been correct, Japan's fighting spirit paradigm would undoubtedly have won the war. Latent industrial military strength would count for little if the American people did not consent to fight. But from the day Nagumo's carriers attacked Pearl Harbor, there was never any realistic prospect that the United States would fail to conquer and subjugate Japan. The American conception of fighting spirit was very different from that of the Japanese, but once fully aroused, it was sufficient to the task and sufficiently resilient. Bob Sherwood, the playwright turned presidential speechwriter, offered a very wise and provocative observation on this topic. Writing shortly after the war, he concluded that the American people's collective morale did not become a vital consideration.
And again, where does all this stuff live? What is all this stuff? It's instantiated in, well, does it have agency? Does it have consciousness? We certainly participate in the consciousness. And in a sense, like all of the, I mean, how does all this work? There it all is, though. We easily see it, and we manage it, and we manage it all via basically narrative.
Morale was never particularly good nor alarmingly bad. There was a minimum of flag-waving and parades.
I found this interesting because this is an aspect that I had never really known about the Second World War. Because the Second World War had always, Archie Bunker called it the big one. It was the good war. It was the war we had to fight. It was the war that we didn't want to fight. We tried to stay out of it, but Japan and Germany pulled us in.
It was the first war in American history in which the general disillusionment preceded the firing of the first shot.
And this in obviously great contrast to the Spanish-American War that I've spoken about in some of the other videos.
It has been called, from the American point of view, the most unpopular war in history, but that could be taken as proof that the people for once were not misled as to the terrible nature and extent of the task that confronted them. Broadly united behind the war, the United States nonetheless remained a fractious democracy. There was no sudden scarcity of partisan acrimony, scandal-mongering, electioneering, labor strife, violent crime, war profiteering, bid-rigging, ration dodging, race riots, black marketeering, and bureaucratic turf skirmishing.
What was so funny when listening to The Rest is History about what happened on January 6th is that you listen to Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook talk about it. They're like, everyone was shocked except everyone who wasn't American. And to them, it's like, well, this is the kind of stuff that happens in America. This is the silly kinds of things that you people do in America. And look at the list he just gave us here. But all these things happen today.
The hard people, for once, were not misled as to the terrible nature and extent of the task that confronted them. Broadly united behind the war, the United States nonetheless remained a fractious democracy. There was no sudden scarcity of partisan acrimony, scandal-mongering, electioneering, labor strife, violent crime, war profiteering, bid-rigging, ration dodging, race riots, black marketeering, and bureaucratic turf skirmishing. The hardcore isolationists had professed to fall in line behind the war, but they generally continued to hate the president and his circle of advisers no less ardently than they had before Pearl Harbor. Influential voices in Congress and the press demanded that the great weight of American power be turned away from Europe toward the Pacific. Roosevelt's critics suggested that the president should relinquish his constitutional powers as commander-in-chief and confer them upon a properly qualified military authority, perhaps in the person of General MacArthur. CBS broadcaster Elmer Davis famously quipped, "There are some patriotic citizens who sincerely hope that America will win the war, but they also hope that Russia will lose it. And there are some who hope that America will win the war, but that England will lose it. And there are some who hope that America will win the war, but that Roosevelt will lose it."
And again, I mean, a divided nation? That's who we are.
Even so, the retooling of the American economy for war was accomplished in remarkably little time. In April 1942, the U.S. War Production Board announced that the United States was already outproducing the Axis. The swift mobilization was overseen by an alphabet soup of new federal agencies: OPA, OPM, DPC, WPB, WRB, and SPAB. Office of Price Administration, Office of Production Management, Defense Plant Corporation, War Production Board, War Resources Board, Supply Priorities and Allocations Board. It was not enough to write new federal contracts for ships, airplanes, and tanks. To effect an overnight militarization of the American economy, it was thought necessary to control the allocation of vital materials and even to ban private industry from serving consumer markets. William Knudsen, chief of the Office of Production Management, OPM, refused to allow scarce raw materials to be fed into Detroit's automobile assembly lines. The nation could no longer afford to manufacture automobiles for non-military uses, he said, because there was not enough rubber for the tires. The factories would manufacture weapons of war or they would not manufacture at all. The intrusion of federal power into the private economy was unprecedented in all of American history up to that time and ever since, but the effort succeeded in spectacular fashion. Between 1940 and 1943, Britain tripled its war production, Germany and Russia doubled theirs, and Japan increased its war production fourfold. In that 3-year period, the United States multiplied its war production by 25 times. U.S. aircraft production had stood at...
Now you might say, well, America wasn't at war. No, but America was selling arms to the British and the Chinese and anyone else that America that was going to fight. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine, well, this isn't new. This is, we'd rather have Ukrainian sons die rather than Americans die, so send them the weapons. They want to fight. We'll give them the stuff. Lend-lease.
5,856 units in 1939. In 1942, the figure reached 25,436. In the year 1944 alone, the United States would produce 96,318 aircraft, more than Japan's total production between 1939 and 1945.
America would produce almost 100,000 aircraft in those 6 years. I mean, think about that. 100,000 aircraft. It's an enormous number of planes.
Shortly after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt approved a proposal to augment the 1940 Naval Expansion Bill to build an additional 8 aircraft carriers, 24 cruisers, 102 destroyers, and 54 submarines, a total of 900,000 tons. The keels would all be laid by 1944. But even these plans were not sufficiently grand. In January 1942, the General Board of the Navy envisioned a fleet composed of 34 battleships, 24 carriers, 12 battle cruisers, 104 other cruisers, 379 destroyers, and 207 submarines. Since the nation's shipyards were already producing at capacity, there were only so many new keels that could be laid right away. By 1945, however, the U.S. Navy would be larger, as measured either by number of ships or tonnage, than the combined fleets of every other navy in the world.
So you see this massive transformation.
Well, one of the surprising things that comes out of it is the idea that we are aiming when we're acting. That is, in the world, when we're moving, when we're doing things, we're always kind of aiming towards the good and avoiding the bad, we could say. And that actually becomes, in a certain manner, the definition of how we perceive objects themselves, right? Like if I see an apple, without even thinking about it, I'm always asking myself, is it a good apple? Is it an apple that will reach its purpose? And when we say its purpose, it's actually our embodied human purpose. That is, if I see an apple, I'm asking myself, is it good to eat?
Right,
That's
and
then
you're also assuming then there's a platonic element to that too. So, like, does it fulfill its function as an apple, which would be for us, it would be, well, it's ripe and it's not rotten and it's delicious, and then the reason you see it's tied into an ethic, and you might say, well, what kind of ethic is it tied in? So it's like, well, do you want to eat? And do you eat because you want to live? And do you want to live because you think living is worthwhile? And to what end are you devoting your life? And you think, well, none of that's there when I see an apple. And that's absolutely 100% wrong. All of that is there when you see everything. And so you're embedded in an ethic of aim, and you can't organize your perceptions with it without that. And that ethic of aim, fundamentally, the highest order aims, or the most fundamental aims, you can use either metaphor, so the most basic things or the highest things, they are phenomenologically religious in structure. And I mean that by definition. So like when you talk about the deepest things, and so those would be the things that move you the most, or the things that are your ultimate aim, you're in the landscape that produces religious experiences when people are in that domain. And that's deeply rooted biologically. So one of the religious instincts, for example, is the instinct that's associated with awe and with the compulsion to imitate. So, maybe you imitate a hero, and the ultimate hero would be a divine figure. And so that's why, for example, religious people might talk about the imitation of Christ. But that experience of awe, which you might have when you look up at the night sky, that's associated with piloerection, which is the feeling of your hair standing on end.
And of course, national stuff, weapons, armies, the Japanese soldiers imagining themselves as the limbs of the emperor.
Or chills running up and down your back, which sometimes you'll feel, for example, if you listen to music and you're deeply moved by it. And that is a reflex that's probably 60 million years old, because it's the same reflex that you see a cat when it sees a dog, maybe it's afraid, it puffs itself up. That's piloerection, and does that so it looks big, and then it dances sideways. And it's the experience the cat is having is something like the experience.
All of the jiggling of numbers in Japan. Oh, we're just ready to attack California, even though their fleet had to go back, and now they know they're not going to get Midway, and they're definitely not going to get Hawaii. And that things are looking grim. But no, you've got to keep up appearances. Well, why? Well, for all of this, for morale.
Of awe. And that's not cognitive. Like, that's 60 million years old. It's really old. And it's a primary religious experience. And so, it's tied into perception in an extraordinarily deep level, partly because the things that you're in awe of will be the things towards which you orient your perceptions and your actions at the highest level of organization. And so that's actually what the awe experience in some sense is for, right? It's to show you what is at the top of the structure that directs your attention. And that happens with everything you do.
So I hope you enjoyed this little foray into the war in the Pacific and how I sort of relate it to all of the little talk in this little corner of the internet, and how the language is sort of assimilating into my view and understanding of, well, why would this be important to me? Well, I'm a pastor and a leader in a denomination. Rod Dreher had one of the more memorable takes on the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church. Last week, the Christian Reformed Church, the denomination that controls Calvin University, stood in front of the woke train yelling, "Stop!" and they stopped it. Now, of course, that's a moment of bitter conflict in the denomination right now. But just look at the metaphor, look at the language, look at the liturgy, look at all of this. If you want to act with wisdom and skill in the bodies with which you participate, have awareness of the bodies. And again, we all sort of have this, we all do this, and you get good at it, just like Nimitz when he hears that Torpedo 8 is wiped out, that all of the money and lives and resources into these torpedo aircraft are just basically wasted. None of it works. But the dive bombers, those worked. Well, and Nimitz immediately sees the meaning. He sees meaning. And we see stories just intuitively, and sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong. But this is why we pay attention and why we want to have more awareness and consciousness as we work at this level. And I think that's why, well, again, for Peterson, it's very interesting because, well, it leads to church. And church now makes sense in the world. Sun Tzu understood that. The battles are fought in the temples before they're ever fought on the battlefield. It's the It's the makeup of who we are and how we are and what we deny ourselves and what we indulge in and how we relate to one another and when we do and why. And we all want to know how to do this. We all want to know how to act in the world and towards what end. Luke Burgess had a very interesting Substack today on the directional language of interior movement that Cal Zeldin pointed me to. Really a good piece. Talks about Augustine. I've been reading a lot of Augustine recently, partly as a research for a potential new book project. I was struck to find that in his Confessions, Augustine described the period just prior to his conversion experience as one in which mimetic models of desires were the main catalyst. Augustine was studying in Carthage at the time, and he was increasingly anxious and unsettled. It seemed to him that he was wasting his life away following his egotistical desires, including his burgeoning passions at every step of the way. All the while, he longed for an interior peace which eluded him. He lived in an unbearable tension between desiring something intellectually, a new way of life, and his revelation that his will was too weak to pursue it, a nightmare. His will does what it wants, a wise mentor once told me, after I flung myself at his feet, lamenting my inability to stop doing something I told him I didn't want to do. One could see the good and know the good, but it was not capable of doing the good. Now, again, look at the Japanese, and the Japanese say, we are full of, we are able to deprive ourselves. There's something heroic about depriving ourselves and abstinence in the goal of a higher goal. And we can sense that higher goal as sort of this communal goal. Back to our story. Augustine speaks with an official of the emperor's court named Ponticianus. He shares with Augustine, amused and perplexed at the same time, that two of his friends had recently stumbled into the home of a Christian and found within it a copy of the book The Life of St. Anthony by Athanasius. He took and read the book, and he learned how Antony, after hearing the words of Jesus to the rich man, "If you would be perfect, go and sell what you have and give it to the poor and come follow me," followed them immediately. Anthony, after hearing the story, left everything behind and dedicated his life to this pursuit. Today, Anthony is known as the first desert father, one of the first to flee the cities of Egypt and to live a hermetic life in the desert outside the cities, so as to better be able to dedicate themselves wholly to the pursuit without the influences of the city assaulting him daily. After reading this book, Ponticianus' two friends, both minor officials of the Roman Empire, were shaken to their core. They made the decision to follow the heroic model of Anthony and to do as he did. They left their posts and dedicated themselves fully to a Christian life. Now, Ponticianus tells his story thinking nothing of it. That spirit has no grip on him. Why does it grip these younger men? These younger men who we would imagine are just filled with all sorts of desires and passions. One can picture him knocking back some wine, tossing some garin-soaked turnips into his mouth like a handful of nuts, laughing, snorting, smirking his way through the tale of these foolish kinds. But when he left Ponticianus' house, I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments. Augustine found himself in a state of profound anguish. How could these two Roman officials respond in such a radical manner as I would like to, but seem unable to? What is he desiring? He's desiring to participate in something meaningful, in something large, in something communal, not individual. The individual and the communal will merge. And this can mobilize, and of course this mobilization through Augustine and how many more of his day will sweep through the Roman Empire and change the world. He had been given the model of desire by Ponticianus without Ponticianus even knowing it. In fact, there was a cascade of mimetic desire. Anthony is acted upon by the story of the rich young man in the Gospels. Anthony's story affected the two Roman officials that Augustine heard in the story, and their actions haunted Augustine and seemed to call him to action. The model of desire pierced his heart and increased his tension, revealing to him the truth of his own thin desires. He described the interior wrestling he did after hearing the story, at which point he lays down a fig tree to weep for his miserable life. Note the paraphrases below, emphasis, mind, pay attention to the language. I was held back by the mere trifles, the most paltry inanities, all my old attachments. They plucked at my garment of flesh and whispered, "Are you going to dismiss us?" From this moment we shall never be with you again, forever and ever. From this moment you will never be allowed to do this thing or that, forevermore. These voices no longer barred my way, blatantly contradictory, but their mutterings seemed to reach me from behind, as though they were stealthily plucking at my back, trying to make me turn my head when I wanted to go forward. Yet in my state of indecision, they kept me from tearing myself away, from shaking myself free of them, and leaping across the barrier to the other side where you were calling me. As Tim Gallagher has pointed out, this kind of directional language is the key to understanding what's happening inside of Augustine. Held back from behind, go forward, tear himself away to the other side. The language paints a picture of two directions that Augustine is caught in the tension, before, forwards, and backwards. He seems to know what his telos is. Now he sees an interior battle playing out that either inclines his will towards that end or restrains it or causing it to move in another direction. In other words, he is able to use directional language in the first place because he has discerned something good, true, and beautiful towards which a life he should move. Hearing the story about two Roman officials who walked away from everything is almost too much for Augustine to bear at this time. The story incites a positive mimetic desire in Augustine to make him vacillate between envy and awe. He has a choice to make. He could write off the story as two silly star-crossed kids who forfeited their lucrative careers by seeking some illusory treasure. But he feels in his heart of hearts that there is something heroic about their actions. He will always be haunted by the question, what if? Then he has a vision of continence, embodied as a woman, who asks him, can you not do what these men and women do? A direct appeal to mimetic desire. Augustine, who has been talking himself out of taking any radical action, suddenly finds some consolation in the idea that maybe he can move forward and stop being paralyzed by fear. This followed by the now famous moment when he hears the voice of a child saying, Tole lege, take and read. Upon hearing these words, he picked up a Bible and reads a passage from Paul that pushes him over the edge. Where is this? Is it communal? Is it global? Is it cultural? How does this move through us? What do we call this? This movement, this spirit, this desire, this pursuit of a telos, this pursuit of an end, this pursuit of a pearl of great price? Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.